The stormy night. The sky was dark, the wind howled through the rooftops, and rain poured down heavily, as if trying to swallow the small village whole. Inside a small riverside house, Mrs. May, once a kind and quiet woman, suddenly changed. She sat by the window, staring blankly into the storm, her lips moving as if whispering to someone unseen. When her son called out, "Mom, are you okay?" she didn't respond. Instead, she let out a faint smile and murmured, "It's coming back. It's here." The family was confused but assumed she was just tired. Little did they know, the nightmare had only begun. Strange transformations. As night fell, the house grew unnaturally cold, even though the rain outside had stopped. The family was fast asleep when suddenly a strange thud, thud echoed through the house. They jolted awake, only to freeze in horror. Mrs. Mai was crawling on all fours, moving backward across the room. Her head hung limply to one side, her hair covering her face. From her mouth came an eerie, sorrowful whisper, like someone crying from a faraway place. When her daughter-in-law hesitantly approached, Mrs. Mai's head suddenly jerked up, revealing wide, lifeless eyes with rolled-back whites. She let out a guttural growl and in an unnatural burst of speed sprang upright in one swift motion. The family screamed in terror. She walked slowly, but her footsteps echoed hollowly, as if something unseen was walking alongside her. The exorcist arrives at dawn. The terrified family summoned a local exorcist. The moment he stepped inside, Mrs. Mai arched her back unnaturally and let out a deep, raspy voice. "You have no power here. Leave." The exorcist remained calm. He pulled out a yellow talisman and pressed it onto her forehead. Immediately, she shrieked, clawing at her own face, her nails digging into her skin. She thrashed wildly, her body convulsing violently, as if something inside her was resisting with all its might. The exorcist pulled out a sacred whip and lightly struck her back. Mrs. Mai collapsed to the ground, her body twitching as she let out one final, guttural scream. After a few moments, she lay completely still, but her lips curled into an eerie smirk. A cold shiver ran down the family's spine. They realized the entity had not left her yet. A night of terror. Believing things had calmed down, the family tried to rest, but they were terribly mistaken. At midnight, while everyone slept, a slow creak, creak echoed from the front door. Mrs. Mai's son woke up and turned toward the sound, only to be paralyzed with fear. The door was opening, by itself. Mrs. Mai stood in the doorway, her head tilted at a horrifying 90-degree angle, her eyes wide, and her mouth stretched into an inhuman grin. He screamed for the others, but before they could react, she darted outside, moving unnaturally fast, like a shadow slicing through the air. They chased after her, but her figure vanished into the night, heading straight for the village graveyard. The villagers were too terrified to follow. She was gone. The possessed corpse. At sunrise, Mrs. Mai returned, but she was no longer herself. She walked stiffly, her neck still bent, her eyes staring unblinking at the ground. When her daughter ran up to hug her, she did not react, only tilting her head ever so slightly, like a puppet on strings. Then, without warning, she grabbed the girl by the throat, whispering, "No one escapes. No one escapes." The family immediately called for a powerful exorcist from a neighboring village. He arrived carrying a bagua mirror, a mystical Taoist mirror used to ward off spirits. As soon as the mirror's reflection caught Mrs. Mai's face, she let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed to the floor, writhing violently. Dark mist seeped from her mouth and dissipated into the air. For 3 days and 3 nights, Mrs. Mai remained unconscious. When she awoke, she remembered nothing. But from that day on, she became silent, withdrawn, and refused to look into mirrors. The whispering graveyard months passed, and the family tried to move on, believing the ordeal was over. But strange things continued to happen. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., footsteps echoed in the hallway, but no one was there. Mrs. Mai often sat at the window, whispering to herself, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. The village cattle began dying mysteriously, their bodies stiff as if something had drained their life force. One evening, the son decided to follow Mrs. Mai when she left the house at night. She wandered aimlessly, her eyes blank, until she stopped at an old graveyard. She began digging with her bare hands. Her nails tore through the dirt, revealing a coffin. Inside was the decayed corpse of an unknown man, his mouth open in a silent scream. Mrs. Mai turned around and smiled. "He's waiting for me?" The final ritual. Realizing that whatever haunted Mrs. Mai was still lurking, the family pleaded for a last, desperate exorcism. The exorcist returned, this time bringing an assistant. They built a sacred fire, placed Mrs. Mai in the center, and began chanting. As the flames flickered, shadows danced on the walls, forming twisted shapes. Mrs. Mai suddenly let out a piercing wail, her body contorting unnaturally. The room shook violently. Dark figures appeared in the smoke, whispering ancient words. A terrible shriek came from inside Mrs. Mai, echoing like 1,000 voices screaming at once. The candles exploded, and the fire flared up, then everything went silent. Mrs. Mai collapsed, her body completely still. The exorcist watched carefully, then sighed in relief. It's over. The lingering shadow life slowly returned to normal. Mrs. Mai regained her health, but never spoke of that time. However, the village was never the same. At night, some claimed to see a shadow standing outside Mrs. May's window, watching her. The old graveyard where she dug that night was abandoned, the villagers avoiding it at all costs. On stormy nights, the wind carried an eerie voice whispering, "It's coming back, it's here." No one dared to speak of the entity, but deep down, they knew. It never truly left.